Well done, here you are. I'm pleased that so many of us are lasting the distance. I got given the topic of joy and kingdom discipleship. What I really wanted to talk about was the joy of barbecuing, but that wasn't made available to me. In New Zealand, we speak about squeezing the lemon. I don't know how many English-speaking cultures talk about that, but squeezing the lemon is about how much juice can you get out of a lemon. And person A will squeeze it, and person B squeezes it. Well, I'm picking up a lemon that's been squeezed. So what I expect is going to happen today, I'm going to talk about the joy of kingdom discipleship. I expect there's going to be a lot of, as it were, confirmation, linkage, and affirmation. Alexander did such a good job of developing this theme, and even this morning that was happening. There's going to be, we're going to go to John 15, and there's going to be some more consideration of that. So, kingdom discipleship. What is kingdom discipleship? They sound to me familiar and trendy words. Discipleship in particular, you've heard it already, has come into, got a lot more attention in recent years. So, assume nothing. The kingdom is simply where God actively reigns, where God's will is realized. That is the kingdom, or the reign of God. Basileia to Theo in Greek. And discipleship is learning to live in that place as modeled and instructed by Jesus. And the Greek word for discipleship is, a disciple is mathetes. It's where we get the word mathematics from. And it's simply a learner. Anyone involved in education, this should be ringing bells. It is about learning to live in God's reign as modeled by Jesus. And any learning process typically involves unlearning. And we have a nice word beginning with R to describe that. Repentance. So, those that are sort of, the terms, kingdom and discipleship, all about Jesus. And joy. Now, as soon as we start to engage, Jesus' recipe for this was tough. There's no avoiding it. His call to discipleship was very, very clear and very demanding. Sin and its consequences required a cross. Not a Band-Aid, not a fix-it, not a series of how-to books, not a video series that you can watch in the comfort of your own home. Sin and its consequences, that's all that stops us, all that prevents, all that cripples us from living the life that God calls us to, required a cross. A cross with nails and a resurrection. So the way of discipleship, the way of the cross is tough, and it involves courage. And any English speaker may know courage has that root in the French coeur, the heart. It's the strength that comes from our heart. So you will, I hope already, some verses are resonating in your mind as to what Jesus said about discipleship. I'll just allude to them because they're familiar. But, you know, his basic recipe, this is from Luke, deny yourself, take up your cross daily, and follow me. He didn't give provisions for, Lord, it's Friday. Could I have a day off? Give me a break from this discipleship deal. No, daily, take up your cross, deny yourself, and follow me. And it's all about, to use Paul's language, killing the flesh. That part of our humanity, that part of our, which is thought of as being weak, self-centered, rebellious, driven by fear, not in a right mind. It's all about taking that to the cross. And this afternoon, we're going to see that enacted in baptism, a ritual drowning, no less. So, kingdom discipleship, learning to live in the reign of God as modeled by Jesus in response to his call to walk the way he modeled and he walked. And it's reflected in statements that Jesus said, like, this toughness, this firmness. Leave the dead to bury the dead. Or giving all for the pearl of great price. Selling everything to buy one precious pearl. Or if I could have the next screen, hands to the plow. It's a commitment, and in the words of, I think it's Eugene Peterson, a long obedience in the same direction. It is tough, it is demanding, but I've got to link this with joy. Alexander Venter, it was so good to listen to him the last few days. He linked us really well with a few words from Jürgen Moltmann. Joy is the anticipation of hope, and specifically for us, hope in the resurrection. And he joined the dots of the gospel really well to put joy in the frame as a spiritual condition powered by hope. And again, I want to link that call to discipleship, which is tough, which is demanding, which is about embracing our own death so that we may live in and like Christ with joy. Do you associate hard work with joy? Be honest now. Is there a link? Or is discipleship about being faithful? It's hard ground. It's about faith, being faithful, being serious. Or is there joy? There are many Christian ministries and voices who don't connect these very well together. You will be aware that there are many Christian voices, many gospel ministries that major on joy and sidestep discipleship. And there are a few that major on discipleship and say there's no joy now, but it will come. It will come in the morning or sometime in the future. In the 1970s, I was aware there was a term used, the sugar-coated gospel. Does anyone remember that awareness? In the last decade or so, there is awareness that church has often been made attractional. Again, sweet, easy to digest, place of joy. I'm talking about these things because they represent a failure to link joy and discipleship, which is where I have been asked to go. So, the big go-to passage this week has been Jesus' farewell speech to his disciples. So he's introduced them to discipleship. He's preparing them now for discipleship when he is no longer physically present. And this is where I'm going to squeeze the lemon again. Could I have the next screen, please? And before getting very sharp in his words, Jesus does something typically Jewish in John chapter 15. He paints a picture. And being a gardener, this picture speaks to me very, very loudly. The shared life of the vine, the branches, the fruit. It doesn't mention the leaves. And this whole vision of God and living in God and being in Jesus and sharing the life that Jesus is talking about again and again and again. He gives this picture first. And then he goes on to make his statement, the statement that we've heard repeatedly this week, and I'm going to squeeze something else out of it today. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. I have said these things to you so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. This morning in the clip from Alexander, he talked about an upgrade. There is a command being given here which represents an upgrade from the commands that people had. And we just need to understand, firstly, how commands work. For many, many years, I misunderstood the word law. Law, because we have the law of Moses, God's law, we have the law of the nation, and I understood it as, if you trespass, you're in trouble. It was essentially a negative view. And in the world, that is how law works. Until I was able to learn that actually a better translation for law or commands in the Old Testament is instructions. Instructions. Now that's a whole different spin, isn't it? Having good instruction is empowering, is equipping. It saves you. The times in my life when I have listened to good instruction are precious. Now, that is an experience of grace. And anyone who grew up in sort of Sunday school, mainline Christianity, probably didn't get this, because the commands came on slabs of stone and were delivered by stern clergy figures who were sort of moral policemen in the church. And you, second row, what are you doing? That sort of thing. If you went to those schools, it doesn't help either. This is the whole kind of emotional, experiential, as it were, feel we have for law and commands. But spin it around. If you want to live well, if you want to realize what it is to be in the image of God, here are some instructions. Don't kill each other. Don't steal from each other. Honor God above all. You get the drift, the 10 Commandments. And God has been equipping his people from the outset. He tried with Adam and Eve, just don't go near that tree. Just don't go there. It could have been so different. So, why am I giving you this background? Because Jesus gives new commands, not in conflict with the old ones, but in fulfillment, upgrade. And in this passage, he is giving his great commandment. And the whole passage structurally sort of pivots on this point. And he frames this new commandment to love one another as I have loved you in terms of his relationship with his Father. His Father who is King. He is framing this in terms of the love which leads him to obedience, as we've heard already this morning so beautifully. The love that he has for the Father and the love that he receives from the Father, which leads him to obedience, and he's inviting others into that. You want in? You want in anticipation of a doctrine that would come 3 centuries later? You want to dwell in the Trinity? This is how you do it. Love one another as I have loved you. I hope what's happening here is that I'm not offering you a sugar-coated gospel, but I'm hopefully commending the beauty and the grace of command, law, as God offers it, and as Jesus offers it. So, Jesus knew and knows the love of the Father. No interruptions, no deviations, no hiccups or blind spots or walls within that relationship. And that empowered and sustained him, hence the vine and the branches. And he extends that to us so that we may be in union with him and the Father. And in so doing, that extension of relationship is an extension of the reign of God. Jesus is perfectly in the reign of God. I call you to be in the reign of God too. This is how you do it. Love one another, with all the challenges that involves. As one book title I have on my shelf puts it, living below with the saints we know. Get into that. Orientate yourself to that. Align yourself with me and the Father in your love for one another, and you will be in a kingdom space. You will be in a space where God's reign is realized. This idea of extension, it's missional and of alignment. One illustration for this, some of you come from kingdoms, others of you come from republics. But in a kingdom, the coin carries on one side the head of the reigning monarch. And if the treasury are being economical, you'll have the reigns of monarchs past as well. But you'll have the image of the reigning monarch on the coin. Every time that coin is used, it represents the reign, the authority, the credibility, the buying power, the economic guarantee, etc., of the monarch. That coin bears the image of the monarch. And without going into it, but this all comes to bear with Jesus when he's asked whose image is on the coin. And whose image are you? And that's the real question. Whose image are you? And to what extent are we realizing that image in ourselves? And that's where the alignment comes in. So Jesus gives an instruction. It's not the first instruction in the Bible. There are many that lead up to it. But this is the biggie. Love. What does it take to love one another? I come from a social science background, and I love events like this. We're building community. We actually start by stumping this tent out of the ground and then fill it with people. And in the course of our time together, the relationships have a pattern. In many events, 36 hours in is a little bit of a crisis. Do I really want to stay with this? And it's a bit of a pain barrier a lot of people go through. If we were to be together for a month, life would get really interesting. I promise you, it would get really interesting. Laurie, you're nodding your head. Let's compare notes afterwards. That's what we've been called to. Mindful that it's love one another. And if you're in a church, it's meeting after meeting or Sunday after Sunday, or how many times are they going to stand on my toe like that? And Jesus' instruction is, in the light of all these things, love one another as I have loved you. I just wonder if Jesus got his toes stood on at times. How many jokes about Nazareth could he take? Let it go, guys. Because this is what people do, isn't it? We get petty and we get particular and we bruise and bump each other. But our vision, our calling is to be people who realize the image of God, mature and aware enough that this is the reality. So love one another as I have loved you. But I still want to know how Jesus coped with the Nazareth jokes. Okay. So, some scholars refer to this as the law of Christ, which isn't easy language, but it's technically right. This is the rule, the reign of Christ defined in an updated way for God's people, God's children, who are in the business of extending God's reign as modeled by Jesus. How many of you have experience of being in a family business? They're not a thing of this age much. You have. But the family business. And if you are the second or third generation, there is a dynamic there where, well, it's the business. We've been doing this for 200 years. And we are about building the business and extending the business. It's quite different from saying, look, I've put in my 40 hours. Well, that family business mentality is, I suggest, more of what the reign of God is about. We are joining the family business. We are seeking to be image bearers, valid currency of the kingdom. And frankly, when we apply for that, we're not suitable. Totally unsuitable. So we have to be discipled. We have to learn. We become trainees, matates, disciples. So, God is the loving parent wanting to reproduce in his own image in those who are willing. And this commandment and what comes around it, because we haven't got to what is said about joy here, is about that. Little illustration, if you would humor me. How many of you are from the Southern Hemisphere? Okay, right. Do you recognize what's on the screen? Southern Cross. And the pointers. So in the Southern Hemisphere, I'd expect South Africans and Australians to recognize this. In fact, this is on the New Zealand and the Australian flag and various other flags from the South Pacific. So the cross is a very clear marker in the sky. Stands out. It's very recognizable. But there are some false crosses in the southern sky as well. And newbies come and can get them mixed up. But to help you recognize the true Southern Cross are the pointers. Two very bright stars. Barbara, you're an astronomer. Can you tell me the names, please, of the two stars? Alpha and Beta Centauri. So, I share this because it's just a picture of alignment. Imagine the two stars being the Father and the Son. They pointed across. You get in that line. And all is well. The call to discipleship, the call to put your hand to the plow, the call to practice that obedience in a long distance is of that order. And that is what Jesus is. Jesus and the Father are there, and it points in the direction of a cross, which is the dynamic of discipleship. Okay, so where's the joy? Let's go back to our passage, please. Next screen. And that's not my next screen. It's probably wrong. The scripture, please. Bill, can you find it? There we are. Good. So, verse 11, which is actually the hinge point of this whole section. I have said these things to you so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. And then comes the commandment. Now, Jesus, I found myself almost mimicking Alexander then. Jesus wants his joy to be in us. And there are two ways I understand this. And the first way is supported by every commentator I went to. And it flows so far in terms of what I've said about alignment, about plumbing that works, about continuity. The way, this is about Jesus saying, my joy may be in you. It is the joy of the Father, his deep state of being, shared with the Son, shared with us. In Romans 5:5, Paul talks about the love of God has been poured into our hearts. Very concrete image. A jug, contents, pour. And this really works for me, and I found it very effective in Youth Alpha weekends away. Think of your heart as a container. Take the lid off. Allow God to pour his life into your heart. It's that simple. And we're used to receiving from the Holy Spirit, whatever. In last century, before the digital age, it was put up your TV antenna and receive God's broadcast and signal. So it's so last century, isn't it? Yeah. When you have rabbit ears. Who had rabbit ears on their TVs? Okay. You know what I'm talking about. Okay. So that was the thing with, raise your arms and put up your rabbit ears. So that is the understanding of Jesus wants his joy to be in us. The joy that he shares with the Father to be in us. And that's why he gives this commandment. Because when you're in alignment, that will happen. It will flow. It will reach you. It will fill you. Now, that's the very familiar concept, and that's been spoken about several times this week. But the first time I read this a week or two ago, I heard something else. And do you ever have that experience? Who am I to read something else in the Scripture when all the commentaries say this, but I'm actually hearing that? So that troubled me a bit. I talked to my wife about it. I was still troubled. So this is the other thing I heard. Jesus saying that his joy would be in us. In other words, we would be a reason for his joy. I hope you can see it. It describes God's desire for us to be a source of joy to him. Alexander touched on this briefly this morning. He went down this path and I thought, oh no, I'm going to be high and dry. So, our obedience to his word, to his command, gives him joy. So, this is a very minor interpretation. I only found one source that agreed with this, and that was Augustine. And Augustine wasn't very good at Greek. So I asked Alexander Venter one night driving back to the B&B, and we agreed it's both and. It's both us, or Jesus sharing, extending the joy of the Father in us, and his joy being sourced or derived from our obedience. And this is a different spin. It's both and. It's not either or. And what I want to get across here is the sense that we give God joy. We give God joy. That might be novel. Could I have the next screen, please? The age we live in, I don't know this family, but their picture was online, and I've put it up here for today. Family photos. I hated family photos as a kid. I was one of 4, and my dad or my uncle didn't really know what to do with the camera, and so taking this family photo took forever. Can I go? Can we go? And my little brother always wanted to pull faces. No, I have to do it again because John had a silly look on his face. Oh, this time, no, William was looking out the window. Who knows this drama? Okay. Cameras have become, a lot more casual, and we snap photos. But there was a time, and as life has gone on, photos have become precious. I'm so pleased for Barbara and I to have our family photo of our children in various stages on the wall. And I've noticed that, let's say people well advanced in years hold photos of their family. There's so much joy in seeing, this is my family. And for a photo, they obviously need to be together. And if they are together in love, what a treasure. What a treasure. This is a sense I have on Sunday mornings when we gather to be church. The humorist might think God was doing some flash photography last night in the lightning. But we offer that to God. And the sense of us delighting God, bringing Him joy. And Jesus points at the bullseye as to what it takes. Love one another as I have loved you. I find that really inspiring. So, yes, we want the joy of the Lord. The joy of the Lord is our strength. And as time goes on, we begin to realize maybe that in our obedience, in our discipleship, in our willing alignment with the reign of God, we bring God joy. And as I was thinking about this, a film clip came to mind. It's from Chariots of Fire, of someone who it was just a one-liner in the film where someone expressed that they understood this. So this is Eric Liddell, went on to be a missionary in China, and here he is processing with, I think, his fiancée, his sister, I'm corrected, thank you, his sister. How this is going to happen, because he's also a very good athlete. Bill, could I have this clip?
I've decided. I'm going back to China. The missionary service have accepted me.
Oh, I'm so pleased.
But I've got a lot of running to do first. Jenny, you've got to understand. I believe that God made me for a purpose. For China. But He also made me fast. And when I run, I feel His pleasure. To give it up would be to hold Him in contempt. You were right. It's not just fun. To win is to honor Him.
I feel His pleasure. I feel His pleasure. There are times when I'm aware of my satisfaction or dissatisfaction. How did that go? Gosh, you could have done that better. Why did you blink then, Francis? All that sort of stuff. And then there are times when I feel His pleasure. And it's a whole different deal. It's a whole different deal to feel His pleasure, to sense the resonance of joy that God is celebrating, something that's going on here. And you've heard enough from Alexandra and others the last few days to know that the scriptures are full of it. Last night, Charlotte pointed us to Luke 15, the two occasions where there is rejoicing in heaven. And when there is some sense of open heaven, when heaven is not, as it were, beyond a lead ceiling, it leaks, and one feels invited to the party. This may be sort of deconstructing or pulling down sort of, distance between us and God. So when I read this a few weeks ago, that's what jumped up at me. That Jesus is saying these things so that His joy might be in us. This is, and St. Paul and St. John, and again, there are verses that Alexander went to this morning. They're very upfront about their joy. So they say, for example, Paul writing to the Philippians 4 verse 1, "Therefore, my brothers and sisters, whom I love and long for, my joy and my crown." That sounds like one of those matriarchs or patriarchs with the proud photo. It's my family. My joy is in them. My family in Philippi. "Stand firm thus in the Lord, my beloved." And again in Philippians chapter 2, verse 2, "Complete my joy." No pressure. "Complete my joy by being of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind." Now, I've been a church pastor for a quarter of a century. And, I think there would be a quantum leap forward if churches or church councils or church meetings or however we engage each other had some sense that what we're doing here could give God joy or distress. If we had a sense that that's the war, whatever battle it is, what sort of chairs we do or don't have, or what building we do or don't buy, or how much organ or how much guitar or whatever bees we allow to buzz around in our little minds, that the real war is about loving one another so we can be in alignment, give God joy, and get a sense of His joy. It takes discipleship to do that. It takes discipline and maturity and an appreciation that God has feelings. Whoops, I've just upset a whole lot of Greek philosophers. John, writing in 1 John 1:4, "And we are writing these things so that our joy might be complete." What do you mean? So John is writing this epistle because he wants to feel good about those he's writing to. Yeah, that's it. Because they're a cause of joy to him. But isn't that sort of manipulative or self-serving? Apparently not. There is joy to be had when the disciples get it and realize it. And John and Paul wanted those they discipled as disciples of Jesus to be a cause of joy aligned with them, Jesus and the Father. So, this is this first verse still, first part of verse 11. To summarize, our obedience allows us to abide in the love of the Father and the Son, and allows Jesus to share His joy with us and brings joy to Jesus. So that's the first part of verse 11. And there's more. "I have said these things to you so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete." Jesus' desire for us is complete joy, not the appetizer or the introductory course, and that's why He is giving the great commandment. Love one another as I have loved you. I think we should stop for a minute there. Maybe we could buzz, and here's the question. Can you relate to the experience where loving your brother or sister was difficult, and yet there was joy in it? God's joy. Or can you relate to the experience where being obedient as a disciple was difficult, painful? And Helen, I see you sitting there. You set something of a standard this week for bringing that home, what that could be like. And yet, there is joy in it. Maybe in groups of 3 or 4. Shall we spend some time on that? Where loving was difficult, and yet there was joy, the Father's joy. Where obedience was difficult, and yet there was joy.